The horrors of the First World War are well documented. We have covered some on this channel. But one of the more interesting aspects of the war was the advancement of reconstructive plastic surgery. The subject of today's video is Mustafa Ipar, a Turkish officer who suffered a horrendous injury, one that defies comprehension. In today's video, we will look at his life, recovery, and the surgeons who pioneered such impressive surgeries. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief explanation as to the horrors of the First World War and why facial reconstruction surgeries were so needed. While there had been plenty of soldiers injured by the horrors of warfare well before the First World War, those injured in this conflict were especially conspicuous. The particularities of trench warfare resulted in a far higher proportion of facial injuries than previous wars. The head above the parapet would prove a tempting target, and bullets would cause immense damage. The heavy use of artillery also meant that shrapnel tore through bodies and left soldiers with life-changing injuries. All the while, medical developments improved. Better transportation and better treatment meant that many wounded soldiers would now survive injuries that would otherwise in the past prove to be fatal. But it was not enough to just survive these injuries. Doctors and surgeons needed to develop ways to make injured soldiers somewhat whole again. Face masks and prosthetics could help some soldiers, but others needed much more intervention. This was the case for Turkish Lieutenant Mustafa Ipar. Mustafa was part of the Ottoman army fighting in the Dardanelles. This stage of the war was known as the Gallipoli Campaign, an attempt by the Allies to open up a new front whilst the Western Front was deadlocked. In February of 1915, the Allies launched a naval assault on the Dardanelles, believing that the Ottoman defenders would be easily defeated. But it descended into some of the worst fighting. Disastrous naval landings saw Allied troops trapped on beaches. Ottoman and German defenders in their forts proved hard to dislodge. It was during this stage in the war that Mustafa was injured. He was struck in the face by shrapnel from a shell fired by a British warship. The damage to his face was devastating. He lost one of his eyes, his entire nose, his cheeks, his entire upper jaw, half of his tongue, his entire upper palate, and a large part of his lower chin. As the side profile of his face shows, he lost much of the middle of his face. All that remained of his face was his left eye, forehead, and lower jawbone. Mustafa managed to somehow survive these traumatic injuries, enduring multiple operations in Turkey. These surgeries saved his life, but his injuries severely affected his quality of life. He could no longer eat solid food and needed to be fed by a straw. He couldn't speak, only able to convey emotion through one remaining eye. Surgeons didn't have the skill or the facilities to reconstruct his face. In fact, not many surgeons at all did. It was the New Zealand surgeon, Harold Giles, who sought to remedy this situation on a massive scale. He had witnessed firsthand the severe facial injuries affecting many of these soldiers all around the world. He had returned to Britain and was able to set up a specialized ward for facial wounds in the Cambridge Military Hospital, located at Frognall House. Giles pioneered the use of skin grafting for reconstructive surgery on a mass scale. One of the most successful procedures would involve lifting a large flap of a healthy person's skin in what was known as a pedicle. This flap of skin would be located near the wound or area of face to be reconstructed. While still being connected to the donor site, the other end of the pedicle would then be moved to the site of the injury without severing the connection to the body. By maintaining the blood flow, there was a greater chance in the skin graft being accepted by the body. In 1918, Mustafa was sent to Germany in hopes of meeting a surgeon who had the skills to reconstruct his face. Dr. Jack Joseph was a German surgeon considered by many as the father of rhinoplasty. Joseph had been appointed to the Berlin University Clinic in 1892 and became well known around the world on account of his reconstructive surgeries. He had especially proven his capabilities assisting disfigured World War I soldiers. In June of 1916, he was appointed head of the Department of Facial Plastic Surgery at the hospital in Berlin. The hospital he worked at was to offer reconstructive surgeries for soldiers who had survived horrific injuries but who needed further specialized intervention. The focus was on ensuring these soldiers had a quality of life, not merely survival. But such an undertaking had never been attempted on such a severely damaged face. The process to rebuild Mustafa's face would require multiple surgeries. First, an incision across Mustafa's scalp from one ear to the other. This flap of skin was to be used later to form the shape of Mustafa's new nose. Joseph then grafted an epidermal flap taken from Mustafa's buttocks to form the new mucous membrane for the mouth and nose. The wound on his scalp was then repaired by a skin graft, with skin again taken from Mustafa's buttocks. That was the first surgery. 4 weeks later, the second surgery began. Joseph detached a skin flap from Mustafa's forehead, creating a visor flap, which he pulled over his eyes to the area around his mouth. The nasal profile was created using a fake bone, which was implanted under the skin. A mouth with new lips was formed. There were also plans for a permanent denture to be fitted, but this part of the surgery failed. Both of these operations were remarkably performed under local anesthesia, meaning that he was conscious. The only part that required general anesthesia was the harvesting of skin from Mustafa's buttocks. After a 4-week period of recovery, Mustafa was able to leave the hospital, and whilst it was not a one-for-one recreation of his original face, he did regain a face, and with it, a return to some normality and function. But there was still a long and difficult process ahead. He had to learn to use his new mouth to speak and eat. For much of the time after, he still remained on a liquid diet. His nose did not become functional either, though at least it gave the appearance of having a nose. But as for many gravely wounded and disfigured soldiers, returning to civilian life after the war was incredibly difficult. These men had served in the most brutal war to date, experienced the horrors of industrialized warfare, and were left physically and psychologically broken. For those with visible disfigurements, rejection from society was a real problem, with many people preferring to remain in the hospitals that had cared for them. At least in these hospitals, they were with other men who had suffered similar injuries and understood what they had been through. Unfortunately, there is little to no information as to what Mustafa's experiences were like after he left Joseph's hospital. It's understood that he returned to Turkey. We do not know how he integrated back into society, but looking to other soldiers with devastating injuries, it would have likely been difficult, if not an impossible process. Mustafa's surgery was well documented, and it didn't take long for photographs to be seen by the rest of the world. Although I will say now that some of the photographs you could have seen on Instagram give a fake story. The photographs were first published in 1924 in Ernst Friedrich's anti-war book, The War Against War. In it, he published many photographs of the horrors of warfare, from bodies strewn across the battlefield to those injured by war. Mustafa's photograph was just one of the many photographs published. Photos of the surgery were also published by Joseph Roth, an American journalist who sought to present the real human cost of the First World War. But there was little after that. One hopes that Mustafa was able to come to terms with his new face and that he received the support and care that he desperately needed. If anyone's related to him or has some kind of story about him, please share down below. Mustafa's injuries and surgery are some of the most striking photographs ever taken. They are a grim example of the consequences for those who fought in the first truly industrialized war, and they are a real testament to the doctors who sought to rebuild a semblance of normality for those destroyed by the horrors of war.